Roy and his crew's killing ritual had a few names and references. Sometimes they said doing the Houdini when they were talking about it, but it was most infamously known as the Gemini method, because it took place at the clubhouse behind the Gemini Lounge. It's where Dracula lived, as you recall, in episode 9, living sparsely furnished in the apartment there, and most of the murders happened just when they walked in this long stretch of hallway. It would start with an invitation. They invite you to show up at the clubhouse tonight after the Gemini Lounge closes. Maybe it's a social invitation, but usually it's an offer to do business with you. And once they've targeted you, they find out what you want, and they suggest something you really would like to have at a great deal. So you drive up, or somebody drives you up, probably parking across the street because there's a fire hydrant there, and you're only 1.5 miles from the local police precinct. You don't want them ticketing you. This puts enough distance for your killers to get ready. Chris is already stripped down into his jockey shorts and is holding a kitchen knife, possibly one of various butcher knives, which I've taken a picture of. The ones that I'm showing you, if you're watching the visuals, were made in the 1950s. It might have been any of the types they used on any given night. Roy walks into a room on ground level. At some point he'll pick up a towel, and Roy has a handgun on him. Most of the time the gun will have a suppressor on it, but not always. You're blissfully unaware that the men will be laughing and eating pizza while brutalizing your body in another hour. It's dark on the street. The lamplights make it dim enough to see everything, though. There's a large square window on ground level. Roy, or one of his crew, but usually Roy, peeks through that window, pinching the blinds. If you were watching that large square window closely, you might have caught the whites of Roy's eyes, his pupils narrowed into the hard pits of a killer, concentrated on his prey. Would have felt excited, but probably not nervous. Psychopaths tend to be calmer, less excitable when they're focused. Like surgeons, or somebody who's playing a video game. Roy and the crew had already murdered so many people by now that they were confident their victim wouldn't escape. The right side of the hallway leads down to a staircase, and on the left it leads down to a threshold that leads into Dracula's small living room. The living room adjoins a small kitchen and a connecting bathroom with a tub and a shower. Roy's laboratory. Roy located behind the staircase. The lights are off, and Chris waits in the living room, standing in nothing but jockey shorts and clutching his knife. The clubhouse door creaks open on its hinges, letting in cool night air and light. Then it shuts. Someone's inside. The trap is set. While the victim heads to the living room, Roy begins sneaking up behind him, like a shark honing in on his unseen prey. Then, Chris charges out of the living room wearing nothing but boxers and jockey shorts, to avoid getting any blood on his clothes. He has a frenzied look, the knife gleaming tightly in his fist. Before the victim knows what's happening, Roy points the pistol at point-blank range, right behind their head, his fingers snapping against the trigger several times. The bullet tears through their cranium, ripping into their brain. Blood sprays the wall. Sometimes when the brain is devastated and knows it's dying, it causes the body to jerk and seizure, the eyes to roll back into the back of their skull, and the lids to flutter. It's quite disturbing, brutal, and ugly. But Roy stems most of it, wrapping a pillowcase around the person's head, just as they're starting to fall, seizing them, and pressing it and tying it like a tourniquet, while Chris comes in and brutally stabs and hacks away. The victim lies still, on the ground, bleeding from the chest where Chris stabbed him repeatedly in the heart, and a red blooming pillowcase or towel wrapped around the victim's head. Now the men drag the corpse down the hallway and into the living room, carrying the body into the adjoining bathroom and hauling it into the bathtub and shower. The victim stripped naked, his clothes carefully put into garbage bags to be tied up. Now it's time to eat while they wait for the blood to congeal. Oh wait, one more thing. Early on it seems like they just tossed the body in the tub and waited. But later on they had hooks and they hung them from a hook, like out of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, oftentimes upside down. And the reason why they would hang them upside down is because somebody would kneel with a knife and cut the jugulars on each side to bleed them out, releasing more blood into the bathtub. Then they'd wait 40 minutes for the blood to coagulate. That's, of course, going to make things less messy, because the blood is no longer so wet. It's now a little bit closer to jello. While they were waiting, they'd order food. A lot of times they'd order pizza, sometimes White Castle, sometimes something else. And sometimes Dracula, he liked to cook. He'd cook pasta for them or other types of tasty Italian food. The crew often weren't finished eating when it was time to go back to work, late into the night. Nor did they always wash their hands. Sometimes they ate their food with bloody hands. Much has been made out of the crew members eating pizza slices, leaving bloody handprints. Sometimes they'd dismember the bodies in the basement, sometimes laying the bodies out on tarp in the bathroom. Henry would leave abruptly, grimacing, like he was about to vomit. He couldn't stand the dismemberment part. They'd cut the body in 6 to 7 pieces. 2 arms, 2 legs, removing the head. The head would be the easiest. It snapped right off, like a pencil. And sometimes they'd sever the center of the torso, depending on the size of the guy and other factors. And that would leave the spine and sometimes the spleen and intestines hanging. Severing the torso would be one of the hardest parts. You had to really cut through those bones. The body parts were then spread on a tarp and then wrapped in garbage bags. They were then placed in boxes marked meat. The remains would then be placed in the dumpster outside. Anthony had a mobbed-up uncle who ran a sanitation department and a cousin who worked in sanitation. He or his guys would come by in a garbage truck. Roy and his crew wouldn't even have to go with them. The garbage truck would drive out to Fountain Avenue near Jamaica Bay, which smelled so bad you never even noticed the rotting death among the rest of the garbage, if it had been allowed to lay out on the ground. Outsiders were also forbidden from entering, and it smelled so bad to people driving by it was hard not to gag. This video here shows you a little bit of what it was like in there and what they were doing. And I'm not sure if this is Fountain Avenue dump or not. I thought it might be. Perhaps one of you are familiar with your 1970s and early 80s dumps enough to tell me.
Now our genius for production and consumption mocks us. We are converting to garbage the gifts of the land and water so rapidly that some of our vital resources are beginning to run out. In the old days, we threw it out the window. Now we employ armies to haul it away, burn it, or dump it at sea. Tires, mattresses, steak bones, orange peels, cans, and 33 million immortal bottles. 6 pounds per person. 500,000 tons a day. Every day.
So the boxes would be dumped out. Some garbage would be dumped with it, and cover it. There's so much of it, so it would be covered by a lot of garbage. But then on top of that, the rule by law, they were supposed to then cover it with dirt. And in the meantime, you can imagine maggots and rats being attracted to meat, including human meat. This one's definitely not Fountain Avenue, but the principles remain the same.
These maggots find excellent growing conditions on the open dump and will soon mature into repulsive, disease-carrying adult flies. Rats find an abundance of food and a good home on open dumps. They too are responsible for the spread of several serious human diseases.
Where maggots and rats undoubtedly burrowed down and feasted on the rotting remains until the work of the bulldozers sealed the meat off and made that impossible. By law, the boxes of meat were considered a health hazard and had to be quickly unloaded and covered with dirt and then garbage.
After the refuse has been compacted, it is covered each day with a layer of earth. This seals it off from flies, rats, and other vermin and eliminates air pollution. There are 2 types of sanitary landfills. One is the trench method. wherein a trench is excavated and the refuse placed in it, compacted and covered daily. In the gully or low ground method, refuse is placed and compacted in a natural low area and covered daily with earth obtained from adjoining slopes. A completed landfill cell looks like this and allows reclamation of the land. This housing development is built on what was once a sanitary landfill, as is this high school and the adjoining athletic field, and this shopping center.
Well, they weren't able to cover it like that for quite some time, but they certainly were able to cover the meat products over and over and over. Nowadays, it's being developed into a park, and there's still some poisonous areas you wouldn't want to go into, some very, very toxic areas, but for the most part, it's cleaned up. You wouldn't recognize it as ever being a dump because all of everything, all that garbage, the tons of garbage, the bodies, whatever's left of, are probably buried 30, 40, maybe even 100 feet below. Fountain Avenue closed in the 1980s, and from there it's been being redeveloped for the past 35 years. Murder Inc., led by Albert Anastasia and Rayleigh's, well, they hid a lot of their victims in the landfill, Fountain Avenue, 40 years before Roy did. And then, of course, Roy, he added even more countless victims. Who knows how many have been buried there? Today it's still spooky looking. I don't believe in ghosts, but if I did, I'd think it might be the second most haunted place in New York City, or the Gemini Lounge. The World Trade Center, of course, would be first. Spring Creek remains polluted, and there are areas still full of trash that the public are not allowed to go into. But they've come a long way, and there's more redevelopment to go. I personally would like to someday lobby for a memorial for the victims of the people who were buried there. And if you want to see a great video and a great tour about Fountain Avenue, what it's like today, check out New York Crime Spot. It'll mention something about Fountain Avenue and the DeMeo Group. He does a great tour there. Check that out. After you're done here, of course. Now, there were about 20 killers in Roy's crew, but the majority of the murders were done by his inner crew. Roy killed the most. He murdered about 50-something to 70, according to testimony from Vito, Freddie, and Dominick, and FBI reports. My guess is in the 50-something range, which might make him the deadliest serial killer in American history. He's up there. Roy enjoyed murder for the act itself, the power of it, and hence he was motivated, at least partially, like traditional serial killers have been. Freddie, who wasn't a good killer, would break down in trial and admit Roy kept wanting to pull the trigger. And he loved Roy. I don't know if Roy was sexually aroused while murdering like traditional killers such as Bundy, Dahmer, and Gacy, but money didn't seem to be the total motivation, and his addiction to homicide spread to other crew members. And that's all in the FBI reports as well. The 200-plus number comes from the total crew combined. Sorry, Albert and Franchise. Albert, you could have found this out by checking his FBI files, and Franchise only had a casual acquaintanceship with Roy, and he was thinking of mob hits. Roy wasn't just doing mob hits, he was offering contract kills outside the family, and murdering for its own sake. And you'll hear examples of this, because Albert and Franchise, despite being in the life, weren't psychopaths or anything like that. They don't strike me as sadistic people, and they seem to have clear moral beliefs, or Albert did. You can tell they're quite disturbed when they hear high numbers. Roy would break mafia rules left and right. He just wouldn't tell Nino or Paul. If he couldn't get to you, he'll go after your family. It wasn't above him. Because he enjoyed killing, and the murder itself, the hunt, the sport of it, was part of the motivation at minimum, and he oftentimes didn't even need to kill some of these people. Well, he was a serial killer of a sort. I don't know if there was a sexual arousal like many of the traditional serial killers have. He certainly enjoyed the power of it, as the traditional serial killer does. I want to talk about Joseph Guglielmo again, better known as Dracula, which is what I'm going to call him. When Dracula became part of the crew, most of them thought he was harmless, maybe even useless. He was 5'10", 170 pounds, a little taller than most of them, about average in today's height. Now, Little Al was told Uncle Joey was basically someone too stupid and incapable of taking care of himself, but that's not really true. Actually seemed like Roy enjoyed talking smack about people behind their back, and he fed his son a lot of stories. So when Roy introduced Dracula to the DeMeo crew, they found him friendly and harmless. He had a raspy voice, and he had grown up in Italy. You think old grandpa here, right? Except that he really wasn't that old. He was actually not old at all. Montiglio and the crew members thought he was at least in his late 50s. That's what Murder Machine guesses. I thought he looked like he was in his 70s. But he's actually a lot younger. Shockingly much younger. Thanks to New York Crime Spot, who's been helping me with extra research, I know more about Dracula than any of the crew at the time did, besides Roy and Dracula himself. He was born on November in 1927, which meant he was only 50 years old when he showed up. This guy was somehow younger than Brad Pitt, Julia Roberts, Robert Downey Jr., and Keanu Reeves are now. So at first he was adopted by the crew as kind of their mascot. Dracula the mascot. Then one day, they began to take him a little more seriously after they saw what a temper he has and how ruthless and violent he can be. The crew went out to a local spot to have some downtime. And they were going to play paddleball, right? So there were at least 3 courts open. And as the crew were getting ready, getting their gear and so forth, Dracula spots some young men playing racquetball at one of the 4 courts, and his eyes ignite with fire. Something about those kids just piss him off. So then our Uncle Munster wanders over to them and begins snarling and shouting, draws a knife from his pocket, and begins threatening to kill them. Dominick looks around, his eyes wide open in horror. "What the fuck you doing? There are 3 other courts open," Montiglio said. "Someone's got to teach these little cocksuckers a lesson," Dracula snarled. "Don't be fucking stupid. Put it away," Montiglio said. I guess he felt like the younger crowd didn't respect the older crowd by not giving them all 4 of the courts. Later, Dominick would find Henry, and he would say to him, "Dracula's been hanging out with Roy too much." Because Roy was always talking about violence. Now, what the crew didn't know was that Dracula had a long record. He had been committing crimes for years, all over New York State and once in Kansas City. And his police record went back to the 50s and included numerous felony assaults, felony assault with weapon, extortion, and he was charged twice for bank robbery in the early 70s and spent 7 years in prison recently. They had a living Dick Tracy villain among them, and he would become one of the most sinister members of the group. Now they didn't underestimate Dracula. I have to admit, though, Roy could have been a talent scout for serial killers and mass murderers. He really knew where to find the crazies. But the crew didn't just know quite yet how dangerous Dracula could be. That was until the crew dealt with Mikey Muscles. Mikey DiCarlo was Muscles' real name. He was a stocky, muscular Italian who worked out a lot. He was a champion bodybuilder. Far less impressively, he was a gopher for the Lucchese, which meant that he did a lot of things like bring them their coffee and other kind of unimportant tasks. Since Roy and some of his crew were dealing with depraved forms of pornography, including child porn and possibly human trafficking, it's possible Roy knew this Mikey Muscle because he was doing business with him, as this Mikey Muscle was disturbingly also a pederast. Then one day, Mikey molested a boy with mob ties, and a capo came to Roy, having heard Roy was interested in doing contract hits for all the families, and other people he did business with. Done. Great. Perfect. He'd like this assignment, because he liked to kill. He didn't even charge that much for it, about $11,000, which was nothing. Mikey was invited to the club. Roy wanted to see him, and so he went, and he was completely oblivious as he went, oblivious that he was walking into a nightmare. When he arrived, he was shot, stabbed, and while lying motionlessly on the ground, he was stripped naked. Roy then was about to sever his head with his butcher knife, but then suddenly, Mikey's eyes fluttered open, and he reached up and seized Roy by his bull neck. He began struggling, and then Anthony charged into the fray with a hammer, and he swung that hammer straight into Mikey's head, again and again, knocking him to the ground, and hammered away at Mikey's head. His skull cracked, brains and blood and hair mushed together. Mikey was definitely dead now. Now, at some point during Mikey Muscles' fatal encounter with the crew, Dracula, eager to prove his own propensity for violence while bonding with the crew, that he was one of the sick fucks just like they were, seized a broomstick and sodomized Mikey with it. Now, one possibility was he did this after Mikey was dead, another, when they initially took him down but he would have been wearing his clothes, Or the third possibility was that he did it during the struggle. Several men held Mikey. He's all beaten up and bloody. He's about to get hit with a hammer. And at this point, Dracula, seeing Mikey completely naked, would have seen an opportunity to earn some degenerate points, and that would have happened something like this. Dracula, excited to help, grabbed a broomstick, and he shoved the broomstick, handle first, up in between Mikey's butt cheeks, and then deep into his ass, pushing and pushing, like he was trying to spear Mikey's anus with a giant cotton swab on a stick. Mikey probably screamed at this point, if he wasn't screaming already, and the beatings started coming, a flurry of beatings. Whatever happened, I'm sure that Mikey died a very horrible death. And Dracula, well, he was elated to show that he was just as vicious as the rest of them, and not just some damn mascot. Ugh. They were going to have to do a lot of cleaning to get this one to Fountain Avenue tonight, but he'd get to Fountain Avenue sure the same. Later, Roy drove over to the bunker in his Cadillac, with Dracula at his side, either to Dominick or Nino. Nino if he wasn't in Florida at the moment, and Dominick was there to listen for Nino. "I shoved a broomstick up his ass," Dracula boasted. He was quite proud that he had sodomized Mikey Muscles with a broomstick. You'd almost think he won first place at a contest or something, with the jubilance that he seemed to feel. I doubt Montiglio was surprised. He probably thought, well, better he's doing it than me. Roy then interjected. He spoke excitedly, dramatically throwing his hands around as he talked, in his version of an Italian-American sign language that doesn't really mean anything. "So get this. We thought the guy was dead, but when we went to take his fucking head off, he reaches up and grabs me by the fucking neck. Can you believe that? But Anthony, he finished him off with a hammer." "Was Henry there?" Dominick said. "Nah, he got a little sick and left." Montiglio would visit the Gemini Club, where Chris, Joey, and Anthony were teasing an angry and embarrassed Henry. They told him he had a weak stomach and a lack of balls. "Fuck you! I'll kill just about anybody. I just don't like taking them apart. It's just like taking apart a deer," Anthony said, regurgitating Roy's rhetoric. While Chris, Joey, and Anthony continued to taunt Henry, Raleigh, Dominick jumped in, ready to defend his friend. "It's different that it's a person, not an animal. And you're not killing them for food. It's a lot fucking different. It's sicker than anything I saw in Nam." Chris, Anthony, and Joey suddenly looked stung at those words. That's when things became tense, and the three men gazed coldly back at Dominick. After seeing them stare murderously at Dominick, Dominick never felt safe entering the Gemini Lounge again. Now that year, Freddie rejoined the crew, and became both an inner crew member and Roy's chauffeur, even though Roy didn't really need a chauffeur, he liked driving on his own. But it was a status thing for him. He'd even have Freddie's teeth fixed because they were all rotten. The crew would also add two new members. Turkian. He wasn't as important to the crew as the other member would be. Turkian just largely handled stolen cars like Patty Testa did. But then the other member, well, he'd be very important. And he was as eccentric as Freddie himself, though a whole lot more dangerous. Vito Arena now joined the crew, and he would play a key part in the crew's future. But I'll talk about Richie, Freddie, and Vito next episode. Next episode, I'll also start talking about the police and what they've been up to recently, because they were becoming increasingly focused on the DeMeo crew and the Westies, and they were putting clues together. And I'll also discuss Dominick's new friend, Buzzy, more, as well as things that were going on with Roy during this period and Dominick himself. And then after all that, I'll continue with the first part of 1979, which was the DeMeo crew's most murderous year. But again, that's all next episode. The fall of 1978, when Danny Grillo finally lost control of himself. He'd always been an erratic, violent man with a lot of addictions, particularly gambling and coke. His career had consisted of kidnapping, extortion, armed hijacking, drug dealing, robbery, car theft, and he had murdered at least several people, including probably Splain and Ruby Stein, just so that he could get out of debt. Danny Grillo? Well, he had pulled that trigger without any hesitation and any give-a-fucks. Once Danny Grillo lost control of himself, this guy was dangerous, and that meant dangerous to other crew members too. Danny was a stone-cold killer, professional assassin and hijacker who'd been with Roy since the 60s. This was a rare moment when I think Roy and Nino were far more than just fair to Grillo after the shenanigans this impulsive sociopath would start pulling. Now, one problem with the mob, they're such social Darwinists that they look down on clinical therapy, seeing it as weak. And if you start to have psychological problems, and I'm sure many of them already do, you aren't going to be able to go see Dr. Melfi. Or at least you better be careful about not getting caught if you go see Dr. Melfi. Because seeing a psychologist or a psychiatrist is considered an offense in which they can whack you. They'll see you as somebody who might go snitch. I'm not sure that there's a correlation. I'm highly dubious. And it wouldn't surprise me if Roy or Nino had a mood disorder. But that's the position that they had. That being said, Danny Grillo's family were not treated fairly by Roy and Nino, as I'll get to shortly. And although he might have had clinical depression, arising at least part from his gambling and other addictions, he doesn't seem like somebody who would have dealt with it by seeing a mental health professional. Now, during this series, his daughter contacted me to ask if I found out anything new about her dad. And I haven't. I wish I had, but nope. I originally was going to use the photo that you see above if you're watching the video portion of this, the black and white of a chubby cheek guy that looked kind of like him, and it's being passed off as him throughout the internet. And she told me that's not him. The drawing newspaper version of Grillo that you see me presenting, that's the only one that I've been able to find of him on Google. And I was easily able to confirm that it was his daughter. This was over Facebook. She had a lot of Grillos on her friends list, and she had a certain level of legitimacy in her answers that's kind of hard to describe. She said that it was interesting how this case is remembered so well all these years later. She also said her dad was no altar boy. But in any event, she decided she didn't want to talk anymore. I'm not going to bother her if she doesn't want to talk anymore. She was through hell with this guy, and so I wasn't able to ask her for another picture or any further details. So back to the story. For the last few years since Danny Grillo had gotten out, he'd been on a downward spiral. But it wasn't drugs and alcohol that were really Grillo's Achilles heel. It was gambling. Fuck probability. This guy was always sure the next time would be his huge score, and he kept sinking further and further into the deep trench of debt, losing all his money to craps and cards. He had owed, in today's money, over $200,000 to Ruby Stein alone. That's why he'd killed him. It's not even including the money he owes Roy and any other loan shark. And he's not paying taxes, and he's making more than most people make, hijacking and doing other unsavory activities. So you might have wondered, where's he gambling at? Does he go to Atlantic City every night, all the way in New Jersey? No. A lot of the hot spots to gamble back then were actually in Brooklyn and Queens. Now, during the 1970s, numerous synagogues, obviously not the majority of them, but several of them, began fundraising for religious causes by turning their synagogues into casinos on their off days, in which they weren't using them as places of worship. Now, even though this was illegal, it usually wasn't a serious problem other than a few empty pockets. But some of the religious leaders weren't checking who they were renting to, and a few crooked ones didn't care and would outright turn to the mafia, because they knew how to operate these illegal casinos, and they knew how to draw people to them very quickly. They'd pack the place with about 75 to 80 people in a night. And by 1970, it was well established that the mob were the ones who were oftentimes renting and operating these places, because they'd already had one murder in a synagogue by 1973. You'll find corruption among every type of religion in the world, including Christians and Muslims, so this was nothing particular to them, for any people who are anti-Semites out there. So the unofficial name for these gambling dens was Little Vegas. They had food there and crap tables and roulette wheels. They even have valet parking at these little casinos. Gadgie, Paul, Roy, they invested about $500,000 in total for house money, but that'd quickly shoot up to a lot more as people began gambling and losing, since the odds are against them after all. And by 1978, one of their most enthusiastic players was Danny Grillo, and he'd go all night drinking, playing, losing. Pretty soon he's getting desperate because he's out of money, and he needs to play again, and on top of that he owes people money. Now, Danny Grillo had already pissed off Roy once before by murdering Ruby Stein behind his back, and damaging his alliance with the Westies in doing so. But Roy had managed to smooth things out, and although he might have been pissed, he forgave Grillo. Danny might have also pissed off Nino at this point too, before it got back to him, because he had rented out some hookers for Montiglio on his birthday, and Nino, believing in monogamy, was already unhappy with Montiglio's affairs and drug habit, something you'll hear about more next time. But either way, Danny was forgiven. Then around the fall, Danny Grillo, upset that he'd lost everything, began to manipulate Montiglio into making some of his markers disappear and to give him some credit. "Danny, I can't. This ain't my money," Dominick had said. Come on, don't worry about it," Danny said. "Damn it, okay, just a few, but don't go crazy." Grillo agreed, and then he went on to go crazy and lose more money. After talking to Buzzy, Montiglio and Buzzy managed to make $50,000 in markers disappear, which could get them killed. But they did it because Montiglio felt bad and he knew his friend was headed off the deep end. Montiglio and Buzzy might as well have just let Danny take the loss, because around a week later or so he traveled over to Manhattan and began betting at a secret casino there. This one was owned by Matty the Horse, a Genovese mobster. There, Danny Grillo would lose over $100,000 that he wouldn't be able to pay back. Now you see, if you lose in Nino and Roy's casino, and Roy knows you and has some kind of bond with you, he'd at least let you pay it back through work a lot of times. Pretty much all of his crew owed him money. If Grillo had clipped a few of Roy's enemies and hijacked enough places, he'd probably have been able to keep fucking up. But now he's making Roy look bad again, this time with another mob family. Roy forced him to promise no more gambling. In another incident, Danny Grillo had been at this little Las Vegas casino run by a Gambino mobster known as Tony Pep. Grillo was drunk and shaking and throwing the dice, his eyes slavishly following them as they fell across the craps table. He was sure the big win was going to happen soon. Roy wasn't there, but he had told Pete LaFrocia to go get Danny and take him home. So Pete walked through the throngs of people and approached Danny. "Hey, Danny, wait." Danny ignores Pete and throws the dice again. "Hey, Danny, listen, I gotta go, but Roy wants me to take you home." "I ain't going home," Danny said, fixated on the dice. "Hey, listen, I ain't gonna argue with you when you're drunk," Pete said, turned around and hustled over to Tony Pep and explained the situation. Tony nodded. He goes over and takes care of it. "Hey, Danny, you're going to have to leave," Tony said. Wait, one more time," Danny said. "Okay, you get 3 more dice rolls. That's it," Tony said flatly. So Danny agrees. I mean, he has to because this guy runs the place. And he throws it 2 more times. Then he sees Pete. Grillo smiles and says, "Hey, I want Pete to roll this last dice for me." Pete knows better than that one. That's $100,000 on the table. Probably about 3 times that now. Pete says, No, I'm not rolling those dice." Come on, roll the dice." "I'm not rolling those dice." "Come on, roll the dice." They begin arguing about it. Tony steps in. "Look, if Pete rolls the dice, you're still going to have to pay." Danny shrugs. "Okay." So Pete rolls the dice. It doesn't come up the number Danny wants, and he loses another $100,000. So they leave that night. Next day, Pete LaFrocia received a call at his home from Danny Grillo. "Come over." This is weird. Alright, his girlfriend needed the car, so she'd drive him over there. Once they arrived, Pete saw Grillo looking out the window, and he came outside. "You think a girl will save you if I ever try to whack you?" And he grinned. This put Pete off. It could have been a joke, but it's not a joke he liked. So when Nino and Roy heard that Grillo just gambled away $100,000 at a Vegas casino, they brought him in, sat him down, and then they shouted at him and threatened to clip Danny if he didn't quit gambling. It was kind of like a scared straight intervention program for mobsters instead of kids, and run by mobsters. And just like the real scared straight program, not only didn't work, Danny Grillo began behaving even worse. Nino and Roy paid off his $100,000 debt for him, warned him not to do it. This is another example of why I find Roy and Nino to be such utterly fascinating characters, beyond merely the macabre crimes attached to them, because at times they could be so generous, and at other times so cruel. I'm sure reliable killers aren't easy to come by, but this guy had pissed away about $1 million in today's money, just counting what he owed Ruby, Nino, and what Montiglio had helped him hide. And what did Danny Grillo do? He repaid them by reaching out to Jimmy Coonan and pleading with him to take out a loan from Roy for him, something that would be suicidal for Jimmy Coonan if Roy found out. And when has Jimmy Coonan ever been a guy who was generous to begin with? So what's he going to do this for Danny for? So Danny can gamble it away? Other allegations against Grillo include one by Featherstone in the Westies that Grillo tried to ambush Coonan in retaliation for not doing what he wanted. A week after that, he broke his word again and lost $50,000. Now he had broke his word to Roy twice and had been generous enough to pay off his debts. Now he had also broke his word to Nino, who had also paid off the other half of his second debt. Grillo had a nervous breakdown, which is fatal in the mob. Montiglio received a phone call. It was Danny's wife. "Danny's locked up in the garage with the car running." "He'll be right over." Dominick got in his car and sped right over. He realized the end was almost here anyway for Grillo. Even if his friend didn't kill himself, he was breaking, and Roy and Nino were going to kill him. Be considered a weak link. Somebody who might rat. He found Grillo in his car, his nostrils plastered with cocaine, his eyes sullen and tired. Grillo told Dominick he lost another of Roy and Nino's $50,000 gambling. He threatened suicide, and then thinking about it, he said that when Roy and Nino kill him, just make sure his body's found so his wife and kids get the $500,000 in life insurance he had on him. Montiglio tried to reassure Grillo that he wasn't going to die, but at the same time he secretly realized that Grillo was a weak link, at least by the standards he had been raised, and he later admitted that to Nino, something he talked about years later after Murder Machine, and it's something that haunted him ever after. However, it didn't take long for Roy to find out that there was something wrong with Danny anyway. He'd been hearing about fights with his wife and Danny rushing out. "Hey, do you know what's going on with Danny?" Roy said. "I think he just had a fight with his wife or something," Dominick said. Roy shook his head. "No, he's getting paranoid with his debts. We're going to have to clip him." "That's your business," Dominick said. He didn't say anything further. He was cautious about challenging somebody as dangerous as Roy. But later, Montiglio changed his mind. He decided he owed it to his friend Grillo to try and save him. When he'd see Roy next time, he was going to try to talk him out of ghosting Grillo. However, a few days later, when he arrived, November 15, 1978, it was too late. Now, Montiglio kind of differs in his accounts in Lynchpin and Bensonhurst, what he told Capici and Murder Machine of what happened. But what's consistent is he saw Chris next to the Gemini lounge. Chris had come out, and Dominick asked, "Hey, have you seen Danny?" Chris said nonchalantly, "Nah, nobody's got to worry about Danny no more." By then, Danny had been murdered, and his body cut up and disposed of at the Fountain Avenue dump. Then, what's also clear is at some point, Dominick spotted Chris hanging out with the Gemini twins, laughing and joking about murdering Danny, and how he had gone out easy, like a sucker. Of course, Danny Grillo had been suicidal and left his wallet and watch at home, so it makes sense that he would have easily gone down. He'd have wanted them to kill him. But I doubt Chris and the twins even thought about it that deeply. All they could think about is how they killed this tough killer, even if that tough killer hadn't fought back. Grillo's family weren't even going to be able to get the money for his death. At that moment, when he had seen them joking about his friend, Dominick Montiglio wished he had an M2. What's clear is that Dominick began to feel guilty about Danny Grillo, and that his murder probably reminded him that Chris and the Gemini twins weren't his friends. Not like Henry Borelli was, or Buzzy was, or even Danny Grillo had been. And they never would be. If his drug habit became too much of a problem, or with even just a word from his uncle, Chris would be saying that about him too someday. Nobody's got to worry about Dominick no more. Now, Henry Borelli? Well, if Roy ordered him to, yeah, he'd probably whack Dominick. But at least he'd ask why, maybe suggest not doing it. He'd probably hate doing it. Might even regret doing it. But, you know, if that happened, well, the Gemini twins and Chris, they're a different story. They'd be probably laughing, even as they defiled his body, severed his head, and cracked jokes about it. Can you imagine Chris? "He thinks I have a Napoleonic complex." Chris had snickered and giggled like a conceited schoolgirl. And the Gemini twins, who couldn't even stand Chris, laughed along with him. Then, before he could catch himself, Dominick glared at Chris, Joey, and Anthony. They had suddenly looked confused before narrowing their eyes, and met Dominick's stare with threatening ones of their own. The message was clear. We know we're not friends. Thank fucking God some of you guys decided to stay. That is so cool. I appreciate it. It gets kind of lonely here, I'm not going to lie, when you're waiting after the credits and everybody's gone. It reminds me of staying after school for detention, or like when my mom forgot to pick me up. I was going to decode Pete LaFrocia, but that's going to take a little bit of time, and I didn't want you guys to wait forever for this episode. Here's the cool true crime artifact taken by either Roy, his wife, or Albert, or somebody in that family during Christmas in 1980. It's confirmed. Yeah, Vito Arena wasn't the coolest of them, but he was still an inner crew member. And after it changed hands with all these other guys, I'm the one who's got it. So it was taken by either Roy or Albert or one of the family members. I'm sure they all handled it. Unfortunately, I can't show you the whole thing because of some property laws. They own the right to the photograph, the DeMeo estate does, and I own the property itself, the original property. So it's kind of annoying. I can't take a direct photo of my own property. But, oh well, I'm just glad to have it, really. Now, let's see. Vito's holding a Snoopy. It's Christmas, 1980. Buttercup here made Roy look like a GQ model. You have to wonder if Roy was tired of being the ugly one before he hired Vito. I'm normally a nice guy about people's looks, but Vito wasn't the nicest person, and he even admitted he wasn't the best looking guy. Matter of fact, he was such a self-centered opportunist. When he'd later become an informant, he'd try to get the feds to pay for plastic surgeons to improve his appearance while he was in the witness protection. Because let's just reward people for committing a bunch of horrible crimes. So on the back, we've got Albert DeMeo's signature, and we've of course got his DeMeo crest in the front, or a stamp, have you. And it says, this photo is gay hitman Vito Arena, not a copy. And it was taken during the Christmas of 1980 at his home. And then it's got the signature there. So, yeah, the image is owned, though, by the DeMeo estate. I say Albert DeMeo's estate because, unfortunately, I did talk to a close member of Roy DeMeo's family, and unfortunately, Albert did, this is 100% confirmed, pass away in 2017 due to deterioration of his health. I know all the details. I can't talk about it further than that because I promised confidentiality. But all I can really say is that the family definitely wants to be left alone. Yes, Albert did pass away, and there won't be a For the Sins of My Father movie, more than likely. That was turned down for several $100,000. It would have been greenlit, but unfortunately, it was turned down. Murder Machine can still be made. There are some great stories in Albert's book, but it's a little bit too sympathetic to his dad anyway. Okay, it's way too sympathetic to his dad at times. But I was very sad to hear that Albert passed away. He seemed like an awesome guy. Anyway, later.